Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 1 p.m. Eastern Time CME Palooza session. I am Derek Warnick. Let me bring up the slides. This is our Rebuilding It Better, Stronger, Faster, Moving Innovation Forward in CE Redesign session. I guess I need to actually be able to click on my slides in order to move them forward. There we go. Everyone's favorite part of the session, the reading of our sponsors. A big thank you to our gold sponsors, Daiichi Sankyo, John, thank you. PER, Academic CME, our silver sponsors, Peer Audience, Medscape Education, Clinical Care Options, PCE, and our bronze sponsors, PVI, Vindico, Catalyst Medical Education, Semiology, ACHL, Paradigm, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Global Education Group, CE Outcomes, Integrity Continuing Education, ARMEI, Helio CME, Infograph Ed, Med Learning Group, Primary Care Network, Prova Education, and Red Med Ed. You know what? I realized I didn't even say that our moderator is Nancy Painter, co-founder of CH2. Sorry about that, Nancy. Two ways that you can ask questions. As always, you can use the Peer Audience text line to send in a question, 267-6660-CME, and you can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I monitor both of those, so I will be looking for your questions, and I'll feed them to the panel to be able to respond. And lastly, our speaker disclosure. All opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Nancy.
Great. Thank you so much, Derek. I don't know if it's a reward that we didn't get the lunchtime slot or a punishment that we are in the lunchtime slump after everyone's had turkey sandwiches. But anyway, welcome everyone. And I'm super excited to be here today just to have a conversation with some thinkers regarding where the future of continuing education may be headed in the United States. Super excited to be joined today by Mazi, who I think everyone in the medical education arena is aware of. We've got the close-up there. Hi, Mazi. We're also joined by a new stakeholder, unfamiliar perhaps to the continuing medical education enterprise, Greg Garrison from Teach Now, head of all strategic initiatives. And we're super excited to hear your perspective on innovation in learning platforms. And then our third panelist today is our beloved John Ruggiero, who just got off the real presentation on outcomes and how to factor, behavioral change into outcomes. So that was the meaty portion of the day. Today is absolutely a conversation. And the core essence is, how do we innovate as a collective enterprise faster? So let's go to the next slide. And maybe Greg, or rather maybe Derek and Scott, were thinking about naming this COVID Palooza. I'm not really that funny. I tried to open it up with something more humorous, but I think the pause being, I don't know if there's anything that we actually spoke about prior to how to manage through this COVID crisis. And, it's fascinating to see how quickly the continuing medical education enterprise has really come together in this time of crisis when clinicians really need world-class scientific information, and they are actively seeking educational resources to help them get through this pandemic crisis. While it's obviously a global tragedy, the situation that we're in from the pandemic perspective, I think the current situation gives me great hope and a clear example of how the continuing medical education enterprise is really aligned in its goals to want to serve the needs of clinicians. Let's go to the next slide. And I was able to go into our archive. This is a photo of the Alliance conference last January. No. But, I think the punchline is, Derek, when I look at all the sponsors that you have brought together to support CME Palooza, and when I think about we're getting over 200 stakeholders per CME Palooza talk today, There is not a shortage of skilled and passionate stakeholders across the continuing education enterprise. There have been ongoing conversations for quite some time now. I think of some highlights in 2017 when the whole continuing education enterprise came together to support the CME coalition and really advocating for CMS to create a path to provide CMS remuneration, right, for the practice-changing continuing medical education. How this particular enterprise has come together to think innovatively on how to push outcomes and really think through from an instructional design perspective, what would be most helpful for the individual HCP. There's been talk on TELMS, dare I say that, John, but it's not a lack of ideation, passion, and coming together that have brought this group forward. I think referencing back to a brief post that I had put in LinkedIn in November, where we are right now as an enterprise is not a matter of not knowing where to go, not knowing which opportunities in front of us we can build on. I think the conversation for today is about how do you build momentum across the collective enterprise to more purposely choose to boldly move forward and create a sea change, building on the good individual program innovations that we are absolutely seeing. But again, how do you decide to move forward as a collective to create the sea change that we need? Let's go to the next slide real quick. Folks, you may have seen this before, the key point being that the ACCME puts out data every single year. And on the far right, we can see that far left, that the 2018 numbers that were made available at the end of 19, they're highlighting ongoing interest, need, demand for continuing medical education as recorded by the ACCME. When you look at the circles, though, moving to the right of this increase in customer demand, if you will, it's really interesting that you can see who's actually getting the funding and probably more so what is actually being funding. There is not a significant amount of change in the actual programming that this community is putting out there. Let's go to the next slide, because we don't want to spend too much out of this, but the timing of today's CME Palooza, COVID Palooza, is absolutely perfect because out of adversity always comes opportunity. Really thinking through the profound shifts that the healthcare marketplace has seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks with clinicians, what we would call learners, spending much more time at home, many not being able to go in and see patients. So there's a little bit more bandwidth perhaps for many learners to take advantage of learning programming made available at home. A lot of patients now being managed at home. So how do clinicians learn how to manage their patients that are no longer coming into the office? A lot of telemedicine. How do you train learners on how to optimize the currently available technology? How do you look at the technology and think, well, our learners are getting primed on how to really, really optimize technology. I bet there is significant opportunity because the way in which clinicians embrace in education after we come out of the pandemic, it will never go back. It will never go back to where it's come from. And I think that is incredibly exciting. Let's go to the next slide. The key point here is there have been many of you all, even on the call today, that have worked with the Alliance. The Alliance put together a roadmap in terms of how an educational vision over time will be moving forward, fostering more of the true digital learning to smarter learning that is really reflecting the personal gaps of an individual learner. Adaptive learning, after you participate in the case, it is automated. That new educational content will be brought up. We're really talking about SaaS. We're really talking about enterprise. This roadmap we've talked about ad nauseum, dare I say that. Again, what is preventing us from en masse moving forward with innovation? Let's go to the next slide. And I know I'm talking quickly, but the point is that people could come up with a future state. At the center, we as a continuing medical education enterprise have already talked about, we need to be practice changing. We know Medicare, will pay out physicians that could start figuring out how to associate and participate in education that actually makes them better clinicians, makes them better able to show up with their patients. There's a whole mix of ways that we could en masse start innovating. Maybe on the far left, we're going to go where we're really good and it's instructional design because that's our first hook in taking the mountain. But you can look at what we actually focus on educationally. Is it about a new therapeutic agent and making sure all oncologists know the data coming out of the ESMO breast meeting? Or is it about ways to manage community of care practice changes that all oncologists are going to have to face in the post-pandemic world? Here you have a lot of different considerations for a collective enterprise discussion about how do we actually innovate. And with that little tee up, we're going to go to the next slide because the most important part of today is hearing from the experts. So how do we focus? How do we focus so we're not going after shiny pennies that no one will pay attention to? How do we act with purpose and build momentum and energy so we can start moving forward? How do we learn and think, wow, did that work? And did the end customer really value how I innovated? And how do I be smart? Because no one wants to put their head out there on a chopping block to put half their annual CME budget at something at the end of the day that's going to take 18 to 24 months, completely blow up, and you'll have nothing to prove back to senior management. So with that perspective, we have our entrepreneur, our digital innovator, and our business leader. And no offense to anyone on the panel if I mislabeled your core essence. This is just for the purposes of the panel today. It's 10:11. Mazi, I'm feeling like I'm on track. And just to warm us up before, the way it's going to work for folks calling in today, we're going to go ask a series of questions to each of the panelists. And then I'll close each section with comments from the other two panelists. And at the very end, we'll get some recommendations from our collective group. The one pause I'll make is to Derek's coaching when we open this up. You can send in by text any discussion questions, and Derek is going to be so kind to post it to the group so we can truly make this session interactive. So let's start with our fabulous entrepreneur. Let's go to the next slide. And Mazi, I'm just going to set this up a little bit. Learn so much from you. I feel like we are in constant conversations about what you are uncovering. Yes, absolutely, about the future of digital coaching, of patient engagement, of the human and the tech combo. We could talk a lot about that. For those of you who for some reason do not know Mazi Raznulia originally was was the president of CE Outcomes, so profound depth in the science of measuring learning, the science of learning, and led that initiative, that company rather, for many years. He then pivoted, Mazi, maybe it was back in 16. I'm trying to think when you ultimately went into the patient engagement. Fantastic.
Yeah, 14.
You know, and I think we've got a couple of questions. I want to give you a minute to tee you up, but I think the point of the image here is ultimately the essence of focusing, knowing when to move and what to focus on your first strike out into or path, step out into innovation. Raise your sail 1 foot, and then you'll get 10 feet of wind. It's like knowing with precision where to move. So let's move to the next slide. And as we do that, maybe you could just briefly comment about your journey before we get into the questions.
Yeah, sure. The journey has been one of a lot of excitement and ups and downs. But the pivot that I made was to go from physician assessment and understanding and learning to patient assessment and education and accountability. And I think, one of the ways that we made that pivot was to listen to not only the market, so the macro market, but ultimately the end user. So we did a lot of empathy mapping, putting ourselves in the shoes of individuals who are living with chronic conditions to see how we can set up a better service intervention that would help people live with their chronic conditions in a better way.
That's awesome. All right, so let me tee up the first question. I love just to comment that you paused and took the time to really pull together the market research, your empathy mapping, to really get into the heads of what your customer base, the patients, were really going to need. I don't want to tip my hat that may be your answer, but when you look back at PAC Health's formation, how did you know what problem to solve for that would help leverage the existing relationships that you may have had from your CE Outcomes day, that build on the experiences and the expertise that you already had in terms of your PhD and your scientific grounding in measurement.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how did you know which your first step and why you took that first step?
Yeah, sure. From my perspective, we're all very familiar with Moore's the Moore's pyramid, and part of my desire was to see how we can get to that level 6 and the population health level 7. How do we make true impact? And through just various connections and networking, the focus that ended up kind of coming into light was the patient. We have to directly intervene with members who are overwhelmed with their chronic condition. It is not something that you can rely on just traditional clinical intervention and putting more workflows onto the physician. But really, how do you partner with the provider to deliver that as a service? So for me, it was just a confluence of just different experiences, but knowing, in my mind, that we wanted to really ultimately have the member or the patient to be our end user, not necessarily the provider.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, so really think through a conversation I think we had in Florida in 2016 when you came up with your first Pack Health box, and very excited.
Yeah.
I love that you call out for the participants on the call today that you saw an unaddressed gap at the top of the Moore's pyramid. I know a lot of CME organizations have been struggling with data capture in terms of how to get to, say, the level 6 and beyond. And I love the innovation that you chose, which is, why don't we come in from a different angle, and instead of constantly hitting the barrier that we as a CME provider cannot get the data we need to prove that, why don't we go direct to the patients and just start fixing their problems, and over time maybe it's going to come together with the CME piece. Is that
fair? Yeah, no, that's a fair characterization. In almost every CME activity, you hear, why do we see adoption of science to be slow? And typically you hear cost, and the patient didn't follow my instructions, in terms of adherence. Education with services and other interventions that have more direct impact on the patient. I think we're gonna kind of feel a ceiling of how just quality improvement and dissemination of science, has its own limitations. Ultimately, you have multiple stakeholders when it comes to improving an outcome, and we feel like those interventions could be really coupled with education.
It's good. I love kind of reframing innovative educational programming as needing to addressing the needs of multiple stakeholders, and the great innovation on instructional design for the clinician learner may only get us so far in the overall goal of scientific adoption. It's a really good point. Wanted to ask you another question about your innovation of Pack Health. You used the word choice service offering. That's a different product focus, if you will, service versus program, service versus product. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about, from a business perspective, why you chose to offer a service versus, say, a tactical program.
Yeah. So, when we did a market scan about 6 years ago, we noticed that the gap really was around tech-enabled services. So there may be a lot of SaaS models where you license a platform, but unless somebody uses that platform in the way that it's intended, it's really hard to gain that traction. And ultimately, if we are going to improve outcomes and kind of work backwards, from improving mental health, physical health, A1C, medication adherence, those are things that, unless you're intervening in a service at a service level, it's really hard to also only change through technology, but you need a human input into it. So the way we characterize our partners with providers, payers, and pharmaceutical manufacturers to really help enable and keep members accountable in achieving their healthcare goals.
Great. Mazi, what do you think the biggest observation, if you look back now specific to PAC Health Services, what's been your biggest observation that you guys maybe initially stumbled with, but you kept going and you fixed an unanticipated problem, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there are many. I think one, we overestimated. Initially we thought that physicians would just open their arms and say, "Oh, you're here to help me and my patients." But we had a lot of clinical inertia, a lot of workflow inertia. That if this was not adequately described, if this impeded in any way, and nurses and pharmacists currently do, that it would be really hard to make that adoption. So changing physician behavior is still a very hard thing to do. Adding layers of other services is equally as hard to get them to put that into action. So we never gave up on it, though, because we noticed that there was a sticking point with members, that if doctors did recommend interventions like PAC Health, that it had a higher stickiness than if a member just volunteers on their own. And that's worked out over several years, that now we have close to about 250 different provider networks that are recommending PAC Health as part of their care plan for a patient.
It's so exciting. That's great. I think inertia is a really big, how do you work through inertia? I think we can all relate from the CME enterprise of how to get stakeholders to show up just for an educational programming. So I think that's real. Maybe the last question before we close out and transition over to Greg, any recommendation in terms of building momentum around innovating in continuing education? Is there one recommendation based on what you've learned over the last 5 years, say, that you would recommend to your colleagues in the CME enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do a lot of assessments in medical education and as an industry in general. I think we probably need to improve on doing more empathy mapping. I think we need to put ourselves in the shoes of doctors, especially even given the COVID situation. You're seeing on TV doctors who are coming home exhausted, tired, afraid, stressed, have obviously other things to do as well. And yet we want to continue to have them push through another online or live webinar, some other piece of information.
Somebody now.
The learning experience, if we can re-engineer the learning experience through putting ourselves in the shoes of the end user, we're going to get much further in education.
I love that. That sounds like a really collective effort that many across our industry could perhaps work together on. Late-breaking question, Derek. Thank you for posing from the participants in today's section. Mazi, if there's anything that you would do differently, looking back to when you actually started your innovative company, what would that be?
I think I would have raised a little bit more money initially, because there's a long road to getting something that is minimally viable up and running and commercialized.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I think I remember some of those early conversations. All right, we're going to pivot. We're going to pivot, and we're going to go to our digital innovator, Greg Garrison. Greg, we are so happy that you're able to join in. Derek, if you could just advance the slide, that would be great. Greg comes to us with deep background in strategic consulting at Accenture, and then working within the public school system, more from a policy perspective, really understanding the needs of learners, but not physician learners, but more in the earlier ed, high school ed space, if you will. So deep understanding of and passion around helping people learn faster, learn better, and learning to address the needs that they specifically have. He is most recently at an organization, Teach Now. And Greg, I'm going to let you briefly tee up what Teach Now is focused on. But I think the reason I'm so excited Greg is on the call today, I had a good conversation with him last week. I was telling him a little bit of some of the opportunities, I'm not going to say the challenges, but some of the opportunities that the CME enterprise has been discussing for some time, that we see a lot of innovation in individual programs, individual medical education companies doing amazing work at an individual program level. But how do we look beyond serving up unique content and unique program interventions? How do we pull it up a little bit and truly transform how physicians learn, right? And take it a rung up, not just educational programming, but we had a conversation about like, what is that experience, that service, dare I say, building on Mazi's word, the experience we would ideally want clinicians to go through if our goal as an educational community is to accelerate understanding and adoption of evidence-based care, right? And it's just reframing the problem a little bit. But Greg has a really different lens, going to the next slide, because he comes from a different sector. And I thought, Greg, it would be super helpful just to tee up a little bit about what Teach Now is focused on. And we can kind of go from there in terms of how you're really working to help certify teachers.
Yeah, we work with prospective and current teachers to get a U.S. state certification. So we run an online program to do that. And it's funny, your introduction just reminded me, one of the early candidates that we had, it's much more unusual for people to come to us as a total career switcher. Usually they're either in education or they're adjacent to education. Maybe they have a spouse, or maybe they're a teacher's aide or an assistant, and they want to be a classroom teacher. But one of our very first candidates was a retiring physician. I think it was a GP, and our program is technology centric. It's online. We want our graduates to be comfortable using digital tools in their classrooms and be comfortable engaging with their students who might have access to digital tools in their learning. And this man, he ran his own practice. He had, a dozen assistants who did basically every piece of work around patient consultations. And so he did not know how to turn on a computer. He had never typed at a laptop. So that was where his journey with us started. And I think he took slightly longer than the median candidate does to complete the course, but we still delivered a program that made him feel comfortable stepping into a classroom, a K through 12 classroom, to be a teacher. And that's our goal.
That's great. How many students go through your platform a year?
Around 1,200, 1,500, something like that right now. I mean, every year we've seen growth. So it's not going to be, we hope it's not long before that's closer to 2,000, 2,500. And from there, who knows?
That's so great. I'm thinking about the comment Mazi was recommending in terms of if you were to give advice to innovators in continuing medical education, really doing that empathy mapping, understanding customer needs, basically. Thinking back to your company's founder, and we talked a little bit about this, Greg, last week, about you looking at state-specific certification programs. The content, if you will, likely existed. What drove your organization to say, we need an enterprise solution? The problem is not the content. The problem is engendering an experience, creating an experience. So this retiring physician was really hard to change as you get entrenched later in life. Can you walk us through a little bit how Teach Now thought the content already exists, but we think the problem is more fostering a different kind of learning experience?
So I would imagine that there's some overlap in sort of the structures with medical education. It's pretty codified what a teacher education program has to contain to be approved. People aren't necessarily, dreaming up new ways out of the box of what teachers should know. Lesson planning, assessment, classroom management. It's the nuts and bolts of day-to-day K through 12 education. You alluded to our founder. She is a former nun and lifetime educator and researcher who, when she was 73, started this company because all of her experience had showed her that, based on the literature, based on the research that people did into educator preparation, educator training, no program embodied that. They all were stuck in the modalities and instructional designs of 60 years ago, 100 years ago. And so she thought that was a space to innovate around the delivery, the sort of program structure, and also that there was a market for people who weren't able to attend, a traditional U.S. educational institution that still wanted access to a program like that. So she thought about how can we take these elements that we've learned about successful education, incorporate them into a program, and then deliver them at scale to people anywhere in the world. And so the three, I think, biggest pillars that we identified and then built the program around are collaboration. I think it's an interesting question. Most of the research that built our program was specifically focused on educator preparation, educator training. I think a lot of it is generalizable to adult learning, but I'm not an expert in order to say that. But we saw three things. We saw collaboration. People learn with other people. They want to learn side by side with other learners and with an instructor. People learn by doing. They want an activity. They don't want to read things. They don't want to just watch things. They don't want to just listen to somebody tell them everything that they should know. They have to do it in order for the learning to be successful. And we really focused on a cohort model. So you start our program with up to 15 people and one instructor, and that instructor changes module to module, but those 15 people go through the program with you. And so that really has a dynamic relationship with the idea of collaboration, because you get a level of trust and you get a level of comfort that lets you be more vulnerable and prompts deeper sort of self-reflection and I think enables more transformation in a shorter period of time.
That is exciting, just to get a more visual perspective of what the platform is. I think there are commonalities, to your point, in terms of adult learners wanting to collaborate together, learning from peers, and some of the social incentives there. Some of the comments that you had made about learning by doing, I think that's a core tenet on your in adult learning. And then obviously the call out you made with the cohort, knowing that you're going through it together. On that last comment, and I think it ties a little bit of advocating a little bit more for a service in a SaaS offering, creating that experience for the learners. How important do you think that is? And I'm thinking about your last comment about vulnerability, that true learning may warrant vulnerability, and systematically bringing a recalcitrant learner down from the gallery down into, the stage floor. I know we had that conversation last week, but I don't know if current CME design or innovation is really thinking about the humanism of what prevents learners from learning to their fullest. I don't know if you've seen anything on your platform about, the use of cohorts to make people feel less vulnerable and open to quote unquote criticism. Do you want to comment a little bit about that human element?
For sure. I think so. When we started in 2013, online education, quote unquote, already existed. edX, Udacity, those platforms were up and running, and hundreds of thousands of students had already enrolled in programs, courses through those offerings. I mean, imagine what could it possibly feel like to have the same experience as 150,000 people?
Yeah.
it has to be reduced to very base elements. I mean, it's a video playlist, a reading playlist, and multiple choice questions. And credit to some of those professors who led those courses, who tried to create classes within them and enable some peer sharing and things like that. But from assignment to assignment, there's no continuity there. And I think that I personally think that there's an underappreciated, inherently social element to adult education. That if new knowledge is not built around a social context of your execution of that knowledge, right? Whatever ramification that knowledge has on whatever aspect of your practice it relates to. If it isn't socialized that way, consistently and from the beginning, I don't know how successful it can be in affecting something like a practice, which already has inertia and it has custom and it has tradition, even just inside your head. And I think that the way people are built and the way that brains function requires some aspect of a social wrench to get in there and change that type of machinery.
I love that, the social wrench. I don't know if we've ever spoken in CME circles of the social wrench and how we're going to innovate around that. But all kidding aside, I think, Greg, you bring up a really great point of one of the success drivers of your platform versus Udemy or some of the other more generalized learning platforms. The punchline being to really affect robust learning, personal learning, adaptive learning. One thing we've talked about in the CME enterprise is the critical need to personalize the experience at the individual clinician level. So that's a really great point. And we'll ponder, how do we use social wrenches, right? And more purposely think about building that into our innovative programming. It's good to think about. Let's turn, just for the purposes of time, because I really want to make sure we get to our all-comer panel discussion at the end. Just for a moment, I'm looking through, trying to catch up on the technology. Questions coming in. Sorry, skimming. I'm going to come back to the questions and hold them for the panel right now.
They might be better for the entire panel than just one individual.
Yep. You can tell that I am advocating with you. But without further ado, let's go to John. And John, I know obviously you know this industry really well. Really white papers and discussions. Talking about where it is this way to practice education. The picture here is in fact from last summer, tracking in South America. No. Sorry, John, that was a good joke.
I'm sorry, Nancy. I'm having a little bit difficult time hearing you, but it might just be on my end.
I'll get a little bit closer. I'm just joking that the path for success is somewhat tied to the practicality of funding, right? And we know in the continuing medical education space, almost $700 million of the $3 billion market is in fact provided in some form by commercial supporters. It's just kind of the reality of the situation. So, I think that the path forward of really thinking about how commercial supporters can fund the right innovation, obviously in alignment with unmet educational gaps that the commercial supporters are absolutely seeing and documenting. But it's just like that tightrope of wanting to advance quickly for practice change, and at the same time being smart about this. And we've seen a lot of examples where pharmaceutical companies have supported high expense, performance improvement CME, takes time, hard to ultimately get it through. So let's jump right into it. I know in your last session, John, you really were setting up maybe a different topic, but is, how innovation internally within a medical affairs organization, what's happening there? Maybe you can comment on that, because I think that setup will tee up what makes sense in terms of what innovation in CME to support.
Sure. So first of all, I am the new director of the Social Wrench team. I love that term. I'm going to use it repeatedly to almost nauseam. So thank you, Greg, for that term. Well, first of all, Nancy, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I apologize to the community that's listening in on this, especially if you just saw the last session, because I was part of that. So I don't mean to bore you with some of the points I want to make, nor with my voice, but so much of what you just shared, as well as what was shared by Mazi, who I really respect greatly, and Greg, who I'm just getting to know on this session, who I'm getting to respect after hearing what he has to say. So the things that were shared are so aligned to the type of business that I am trying to run and the kinds of collaborations I'm trying to make with either other supporters or with different health systems. And I think you opened up my introduction in an appropriate way, because part of my role in overseeing external medical affairs taps into the oversight over a CME department from industry that winds up supporting initiatives and talks about the real finite dollars that you just alluded to, but also expanding from just educational one-offs into what really the marketplace now demands, whether it's the continued and mitigation of any kind of negative implication to clinical trials once clinical trials have been used as treatment options for a patient's cancer journey. Finding commonalities across the field engagement teams and making sure that objectives are in play and are completely tight to what is appropriate, not just for business, but obviously for the clinical and patient communities, or whether it's bringing in patient-centric strategies to address the kinds of demands that we have internally and making sure that our strategies are completely in play with that foresight in mind, and also building out collaborations with health systems for quality improvement types of initiatives. So I think what you're talking about right now is really at the crux of the importance. And if you don't mind me going into it, I apologize to the community because I took some notes specifically based on wanting to hear what Mazi and Greg had to say. So much of what they said resonated with me. For example, Mazi talked about service offerings, and I really like that term because I've often thought that there's a difference between a CME educational activity and an educational campaign. And many times what I am seeking, what my team is seeking, or what others I know very well are seeking are truly identifying benchmark-based problems that really rely on people coming together to form solutions, which requires a campaign effort rather than a one-off educational activity. And I think that what Mazi has built, and it seems like what Greg is involved in building, are very reminiscent of campaigns. Other things that I heard, Mazi had talked about empathy mapping. One of the things I'm learning in today's world with COVID-19 is that people just don't have the time or the stomach to actually do what we have been demanding them do through our industry. It's one thing to be able to expect somebody to do something that is, whether curriculum-based or even microburst type of learning. It's another thing to ask an already overextended group of people to add to their day and take on further educational requirements in order to meet specific needs that may not even be in the top of their mind at the current time. And thinking through those things, digital tools. I said this in my last session, others on my team shared this in the last session too. Even before COVID-19, we're in an era of digitized medicine, and health systems themselves are trying to build new models in order to operate in appropriate expectations. And in a world of big data, we need to understand that health data is pervasive and it requires new tools and clinical models. The pharma enterprise itself is actually configuring itself into a different way of thinking. We're going from volume of product as a benchmark for our success to the value our product is bringing across the disease landscape. And as a result of some of these ongoing trends, and now especially with COVID-19, we're seeing healthcare transforming into models that are almost like streaming services. Like I said in the last session, I think Netflix or Hulu of healthcare. And that obviously comes a lot of technology needs that perhaps goes beyond just online educational formats and just really develop into, as Greg was saying, adult learning focused, instructional design focused digital tools that allow for interactive virtual opportunities where people are solving problems together. That brings me to my last point.
Yeah.
Something that I heard Mazi and Greg saying a lot, and you saying, Nancy, was this this understanding of what the learner now needs today and what their market is demanding is less the knowledge-based type of education, although knowledge is very important. I believe that was a big section of my last program, but education is almost becoming skills-based.
Mm-hmm.
The market is demanding it to be skills-based, and Greg spoke to it much more eloquently than I am. And what are the types of things that we can design together to initiate some kind of skills-based training that goes beyond what these clinicians even went to school to begin with for in the purpose of wanting to become a clinician. And so I think it's really important to start focusing on these topics that you're bringing to light. Now, I know you asked me to serve in somewhat of a pragmatic role, which is new for me, so thank you for that opportunity.
No, that's like,
maybe you have a question that talks about maybe I bring this forward.
That was really fantastic in terms of setting up, the perspective that medical affairs is really innovating. Everything is becoming a roadmap 3 to 5 years. Medical education teams are under Med Affairs. Med Affairs is becoming smarter. The expectation is insights drive everything. Tactics you invest in from a medical affairs perspective need to capture digital insights. And the products overall, or the tactical investments Med Affairs, de facto Med Ed teams invest in, are those that are really reflecting the skill building needs of the clinicians. So great summary. I hope I captured that well.
Yes.
The question I have for you, and I'm just looking at time why I'm speaking so quickly. Questions from the group. Innovation does not necessarily have to mean new tech or new platform. Have you seen any examples of simple innovation or adaptations, low tech, if you will, but maybe I would reframe it as in the next 6 to 12 months, John, having a strong perspective as a business leader in a major corporation, where the priorities are going for smarter medical affairs investment to defend the value of your therapeutics. Next 6 to 12 months, knowing we can't get to the SaaS beautiful platform that Greg's organization has, or a deep service offering Tech Health has, what are you saying? Biggest innovation opportunity for current medical education providers? What do you think in the next, pragmatically, John, in the next 6 to 12 months?
Me, okay. So I think that coming from a company that's really concerned about data being disseminated appropriately this year because of all the changes, there are specific tactics across the medical affairs organization that may be on pause right now because they require engagement with key opinion leaders or key thought leaders. They require actual visits to hospital sites, and that is really uncertain right now. And so I think that there is a leadership opportunity for educational departments like one of mine and like supporters out there who might be listening to actually compel their leaders and their organizations to understand, hey, this is the time to start supporting education. And not only do we support education that is for data dissemination in the next 6 to 12 months, but maybe this is an opportunity to take some resources and start applying them to innovative models, like something that Mazi has, to start capturing specific data around patient-reported outcomes, or something that Greg was talking about, like exploring some kind of, even if it's with a traditional technology, ways of getting people to come together and solve problems together that are specific to their needs right now. That is what I think happens in the next 6 to 12 months. And then from there, there's to become a campaign, again, internally to show, hey, there are more things that we can do by focusing on programs that are either resulting in knowledge, in attitude change, in skills building, or behaviors.
Yep.
Are quite powerfully handled by those who lead departments like I lead.
Great. That's great. With a big focus on core instructional design, programming designed to build the skills, right?
That's right.
Everything comes together. That's great. I'm looking at our clock quickly winding down. Maybe we'll go to a panel round robin. Okay, so we're going to have one question for each of you. Maybe we'll start at the top with Mazi as the first answer, then we'll go to Greg, then we'll go to John if you want to add to it. But here's the core question. Thinking about everything that we know today about the future of learning and models of affecting learning design, what do you think the major change in CME or CE programming will be in 2025? What is your prediction?
So, it's kind of coupling that question with the one that John answered. I think one of the innovations we should really try to incorporate in medical education is the concept of nudging. I've seen it work really well with patients, and there's certainly a variation that's wide within patient health. But if you kind of, again, do that empathy mapping, a lot of physicians are using texting, phone calls, obviously their EMR. And I think sometimes we over-engineer it where simple nudges and reminders can really alter behavior in a significant way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We're going to attempt to write this up after all of the wisdom is shared. Greg, what do you think? I know you're new, or dare I say not part of the medical education enterprise, but just getting a general crash course in the conversation today, adult learning in general, your experience with cohort-based learning on a platform. What do you think the future is in 5 years for the kind of platforms that Teach Now offers?
I wish that I had an answer to that. The next 5 years would be a lot easier if I did.
Yeah.
I suspect that there's a growing social component. And I think I would just also offer that within businesses, within institutions, different things can affect the survivability of features and components.
Yeah.
And we should take care that what does impact the survivability is just the success. And sometimes we stop doing things because they're hard or because they're expensive or because people who we ask to do them don't know how, or they aren't used to, or they don't want to.
Yeah.
And we should, some of that is reasonable. We can't do everything that we want to because cost is real, but we should be upfront and know when we're making a cost-based compromise and when we're making a design-based decision. And it's easy to blur those lines. And so I hope that in the next 5 years everyone can be more successful at identifying what success looks like and using that as the primary driver of the evolution of any platform, any design.
That's a really poignant point, like really just crystallizing what does it look like when we're all successful. We've talked a lot about the roadmap, Greg, but your wisdom was not missed there, because I don't know, as a collective enterprise, we've actually defined, even in 1 year increments, what success looks like when we all collectively really move boldly into practice changing medical education. So that's awesome. Yeah. John, I'm just looking, we've got another 3 minutes and we're just wrapping up here.
Literally, very simple.
Yeah.
Very simply put, what I thought might be happening in 2025 has been disrupted because of COVID-19, but we're learning a lot of through that disruption. I think very simply to Mazi's point, I think nudging is really important. I think being respectful of people's times and their commitments to want to learn without being overwhelmed, but also bringing that right into the care delivery practice. I think it's really important for us to focus on some of the things I shared about the skills, things that Greg shared too about learning together. Very possible when you bring it right into the point of delivery.
That's great.
And exploring virtual. What we're learning from this COVID-19 experience, it's a lot of people coming out of this saying, I love live education. I love it. I don't want this to be misinterpreted as me saying all live goes away. That's not where I'm going. Yeah. But a lot of people coming out of this saying, wow, there's really innovative things I can do virtually now as related to this experience I'm going through.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And I think the quote unquote live, we're feeling it right now. Right now, we all feel connected. We're talking passionately about a topic that we all really care about. And we didn't have to get on airplanes and travel far away to still have that sense of social connection, our cohort, if you will. And how do you really think about some of those social incentives as we move people forward in the learning continuum? Any other questions for folks, Derek? Anything else coming in on the text? We're trying to be really appreciative of how much time you want to give us.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. We are right on time, so feel free to wrap it up, and then I'll take over.
Great. Well, we will wrap it up. What I will recommend, now that we have a new player in the educational enterprise, Greg, you're going to be asked back, and we're going to be looking at ways to bring you into the fold. I truly was not missed. The Council for Medical Specialty Society, which is an organization of about 70 plus of the top medical societies in the U.S. So the American Society of Clinical Oncology, the ophthalmology, neurology, any major clinician, right? They belong to their quote unquote cohort. And they have really identified learning because they are the truth sayers. They are the ones that set the clinical guidance for any disease state. And they really have a vested interest in building senses of community. I'm just going to put that out there as a plug that somehow connecting your perspective with Helen Burskin in terms of how platform-based learners really do learn and come out of the galleries could be profoundly helpful. So I'm going to put that in as my plug. Where do we start with the innovative? Go with the people that want to innovate and have a financial vested interest in taking the innovation forward. And I think that's a good formula as well. But with that said, we will post a little update maybe early next week in LinkedIn for folks to that weren't able to be part of this to get some nuggets, some nudges, dare I say, Mazi, but super appreciative, Mazi, Greg, John, and of course, Derek for giving us this platform. But super happy that everyone was able to join today, and I hope it was helpful.
Yes, definitely. Thanks to all of you. It was really a treat for me to be able to listen in on this. And Greg, it was great having you join all of us. This was really fantastic. Let me run through my last couple slides here. Please take our survey. I am told that by some miracle, the link fixed itself. I don't know what the problem was before, but it works and people are taking it. So if you have a chance, please take our survey. And then my last slide. To view the next session, as always, just refresh your screen. The next one will come up. I really want to give a plug. I mean, of course, I'm happy that you watched all the sessions so far, but afternoon attendance always tends to slow down. The next 3 sessions, I'm highly encouraging you to try and make out. The next one is Grant Request Rock. This is Scott's version of Schoolhouse Rock. Maybe Scott will sing Conjunction Junction, what's your function or whatever it is. Who knows? The one after that is Jake Powers, CME Detective. If you've did not see the first one we did last time, I highly encourage you to watch it. It is both hilarious and entertaining. And then our last one is our common and not so common case conundrums in CME. That is it for my plugs. Thanks again to everyone on the panel.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
And we'll see everyone later.
Thank you.